Elia only meant to stop by a quiet diner to warm up after a long shift. But in the misted corner of the room, she saw an old soldier and a German shepherd, its eyes sharp as if it understood things left unsaid. Then two men walked in, loud, unsteady, their laughter sharp and laced with alcohol. No one expected the next moment to silence the entire diner. Between mockery and action, Elia made a choice. But what happened that night turned an aging dog into the reason an entire city stood still in the rain. What did they see in him? What did she awaken? Night fell slowly over the rain-soaked streets of the city. Streetlights reflected in puddles like shards of broken mirrors, each passing car slicing through the silence with the weary hiss of tires on wet asphalt. Elia pulled her thin white coat tighter around her neck and walked slowly down the quiet road. The only sounds accompanying her were the rhythm of her footsteps and the soft patter of rain tapping against the awnings above. She had just finished a 12-hour shift in the emergency room, a full day spent standing, moving, saving. Every heartbeat now seemed to press down on her tired legs. A chill wind slipped out through a narrow alleyway and found its way beneath her coat, making her shoulders tremble. Her fingers, cold and pale, clutched the fabric strap of her canvas bag, which held an untouched meal and a pair of shoes still soaked through from the rain. Elia was used to night shifts, used to this strange, echoing silence that wrapped around the world after stepping out of the hospital. But something about tonight felt different. The cold wasn't just the kind that came from the air. It crept in deeper, hollow, and still, like the absence of something unnamed. As if the entire city had swallowed its voice, left only with people like her, adrift unseen, moving through the streets like forgotten shadows. She turned down a small road that cut across the boulevard. At the far end stood a little diner she'd visited once months ago on a night as drained and quiet as this one. The neon sign was blurred by mist, and a warm amber glow spilled from the fogged-up window pane. That gentle warmth, however faint, was enough to make her feet quicken. The bell above the door gave a soft chime as it opened. A wave of warmth and the smell of roasted coffee and toasted bread embraced her like a balm. Elia shook the rain from her shoulders, stepped inside, and chose a seat near the window. She set her bag down, leaned back in the chair, and let out a long breath, one that carried the weight of all the lives she'd touched that day. The voices behind masks, the urgent cries, the quiet moments that followed. A young server handed her a menu, but Elia simply shook her head and said in a hushed, hoarse voice, "A hot black coffee and an egg sandwich." The server nodded and left, granting her a moment of rare quiet. She let her body settle, her eyes drifting to the blurred window. Outside, the rain still fell, steady, persistent, like a loneliness that refused to end. Droplets traced winding paths down the glass, crossing over each other like quiet sighs. In this city, a person could go a month without anyone asking how they were. Elia was used to that silence. But sometimes being used to something only made it harder to bear. Then she saw them. Near the bar counter, tucked in a shadowed corner where the light softened and the space felt apart from the rest, sat an older man with a small coffee cup cradled between his hands. His shoulders were slightly hunched, gray hair falling in unkempt strands over half his face. He wore an old leather jacket, his boots dark with mud. But what caught Elia's attention wasn't the man himself. It was the creature resting silently at his feet, a German shepherd. The dog was large and solid like a stone in a storm. Its coat was a dark sable brushed with brown, and its eyes, a pale amber, caught the light without a flicker of tension. It didn't move, only raised its head occasionally when the man gently tapped its back. There was something between them, something wordless, an understanding too deep for sound. Elia watched unmoving, as if the sight awakened something long buried. In that firm posture and the dog's calm gaze, she saw echoes of her father. Once a soldier, once the owner of a dog just like that. He never spoke much, but when he did, it was often with a hand resting gently on the head of his dog. Just like that man. The server returned with her coffee, drawing Elia out of memory. She took a sip, bitter and warm enough to stir her tired eyes. Yet her gaze remained fixed on that quiet corner. The man now sat with his head slightly bowed, hands wrapped firmly around the cup as if seeking warmth from something beyond its contents. And the dog, still as ever like a shadow that chose to stay. Though it didn't turn toward her, Elia had the strange sense that the dog knew she was watching. Its ears twitched. Its body shifted slightly, as if responding to something not spoken aloud. A pair of headlights passed by the window, casting their silhouette onto the glass. A man and a dog fused into one shape. Elia looked away, trying to focus on the now cold sandwich in front of her. But her mind kept returning to that image. This city might be crowded, it might be loud, but it was full of silent people, each carrying their own kind of quiet. And sometimes it only took a single glance, a brief encounter with someone else's stillness, to make you feel a little less lost. Then the bell above the door rang again. But this time, it wasn't gentle. The sharp laughter of two men cut through the warmth, disturbing the calm like a stone thrown into still water. Elia had no way of knowing that what began as a passing glance between a weary nurse, a quiet old soldier, and a dog who seemed made of patience was about to turn into a night none of them would ever forget. She remained at her table, hands curled around the steaming mug. Outside, the city blurred beneath the rainy glass like a faded painting. But inside, the small diner time seemed to pause, especially near the corner counter where an aging man and his dog shared a silence that felt stronger than words. She couldn't quite explain why she kept looking. Maybe it was the way the man held his cup. Not with hesitation, nor with urgency, but with calm certainty, like someone who had long since learned to steady the things others could not. He sat upright, chin tilted slightly, not speaking to anyone, not reacting to the newcomers, yet his eyes, keen and steady, scanned the room in slow motion, the instinct of someone who had once lived through too much to ever stop watching. She guessed he was in his early 60s, but his movements were efficient, disciplined. On the table sat a black coffee and a plain sandwich untouched. He took slow, measured sips, as if making the most of this rare moment to breathe. Elia glanced down at the floor near the man's feet, and finally saw him clearly. The dog was unmistakably a German shepherd, aged and seasoned. Its ears stood tall. Its thick neck rested with quiet strength, and its front legs were crossed with a calm dignity. The tail curled neatly to the side. There were streaks of gray around its muzzle, and eyes, signs of time, gently brushing through its fur. But its body still held firm, composed, like a soldier quietly awaiting command. She had seen dogs like this before at the rescue center. She had read the files too, those records of retired working dogs who had once served alongside military handlers. What always struck her was this: once bonded with their human partners, these dogs would carry their loyalty to the final breath. Without question, without hesitation. There was no leash between the man and his dog. There was no need for one. A subtle tilt of the man's head, and the dog responded. A slow stroke along the spine, and the animal's body relaxed. What existed between them was not taught, it was lived. A bond forged in quiet and trust deeper than words could ever reach. Elia's gaze dropped back to her coffee cup. And in that stillness, something stirred inside her. A flicker of memory. The way the man lifted his coffee fingers, folded gently over the handle, his wrist tilting just enough, almost as though he were pouring warmth into himself. It made her chest tighten. Because for the briefest moment, she saw her father. Her father had been a Marine. A quiet man, not fond of grand gestures, but his nods and the gentle weight of his hand on her shoulder always spoke volumes. After leaving the service, he never fully found his place in the world outside. He lived simply slowly, and the only time Elia truly saw him open up was when he was with Scout, his aging German shepherd who had once crossed battlefields with him. As a child, Elia used to sit on the windowsill and watch her father brew coffee each morning. Black, no sugar. He would settle onto the wooden chair on their porch, and Scout would lie beside him, eyes half closed in that soft morning light. When the wind picked up, her father would tighten his grip around the cup, and Scout would inch closer, resting his head on his boots. They never said a word. But in that silence, Elia always felt a safety she couldn't explain. And now, it was as if that memory had returned, replaying itself in the quiet corner of this diner, in the way David sat in the grounded, steady eyes of Ronan. A part of her father seemed to live in the man, and the rest, in the gentle presence of that old dog still holding watch. She wrapped her fingers around the cup, eyes fluttering shut. Outside, the rain continued to tap on the metal roof. Somewhere behind her, a spoon clinked against porcelain. The diner was still busy, still alive, but all she could see was that pair in the corner, a man carved by experience and a four-legged companion carrying half his burdens. She found herself wondering where the man had been, what he had seen. The worn shoulder seams of his coat, the dried mud on his boots. Each detail whispered a story never told aloud. And perhaps it was the silence that made it echo louder. Maybe it was because she understood that silence that Elia felt drawn in, as if some invisible thread connected people who had known loss. David reached out and gently placed a hand atop Ronan's head. The old dog looked up at him, eyes gleaming with something calm, something deep. That gaze made Elia's chest grow warm. There was something in the dog's eyes that made you want to believe. A kind of belief that had been bruised and weathered, but still held firm. And at that very moment, just as Elia was adrift in memory, the diner door swung open again. This time the wind carried something colder, louder. The harsh laughter of two men ripped through the warmth, shattering the stillness like glass underfoot. Elia opened her eyes and looked toward the entrance, then turned slowly back to the bar. David hadn't moved. But Ronan had. The dog had lifted his head, ears pointed sharply toward the source of the disturbance. No growling, no barking, just a shift in posture, upright, alert, watching. And Elia, who had until now only been an observer, was about to witness the beginning of a night longer than any shift she'd ever endured. The door thudded shut behind them, shaking slightly in its frame. A cold gust swept between the tables. The two men entered rain-soaked and disheveled, their jackets creased and damp, the sharp tang of alcohol clinging to their skin, even before a word left their mouths. But it didn't take long for the whole diner to feel what they'd brought in with them, a weight of chaos, unsteady and poised to spill. The taller one, eyes bloodshot, shook the water from his hair and scoffed. Cold as a dead dog out there. Lucky this place is still open. The shorter man smirked. Yeah. Too bad it smells like a real mutt in here. Makes me want to puke. Elia tensed at the words. It wasn't just the crudeness. It was the way they were said, aimed deliberately. Her eyes shifted back toward David. He remained still, gaze fixed on his coffee. His hand rested gently on Ronan's back. And Ronan, the old shepherd, sat like stone, unshaken. Not a muscle flinched. His eyes, calm but sharp, locked onto the newcomers, as if reading every breath they took. The diner fell into an uneasy hush. The young server hovered behind the counter, clearly unsettled. Elia could feel it too, that prickling tension curling through the air. The shorter man took a few steps forward, raising a finger to point at Ronan. What's an old mutt like that doing in a place like this? Thought health code banned flea bags from food joints. Still, David didn't react. He simply moved his hand to the back of Ronan's neck. A small touch, light but grounding. It was all Ronan needed to stay steady. "Hey," the man barked, louder, voice thick with mockery. "You deaf old man." I said something. Elia clenched the ceramic mug in both hands, blood rushing hot through her veins. She knew this type, had seen them too many times in hospital corridors. Drunk, loud, believing their noise gave them power. The tall one leaned in slightly, sizing up Ronan with an ugly grin. "Look at that face. Eyes like a rabid mutt. Bet he was trained to kill, huh? Bet he used to rip throats out on the battlefield. That's what these dogs do, right? Clean up soldier scraps." The laugh that followed reeked of something sour, half cruelty, half cowardice. Elia quietly pushed her chair back. She drew in a deep breath, hoping, just for a moment, to let it all pass like she usually did. But then her eyes found them again. David, still sitting with that unwavering posture, calm eyes and quiet presence. And Ronan, the same steady stillness, but now something in his gaze had shifted. It wasn't fear. It was the gaze of a being who had seen the worst the world had to offer, and was now silently enduring a fresh kind of cruelty. She stood up, calmly, but with purpose. "That's enough," Elia said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly across the diner. "You two need to leave." Both men turned sharply, surprised to see the small woman challenging them. The shorter one sneered. "Well, look who found her wings. You like dogs that much, sweetheart? Or is it the old man that's got your attention?" Elia didn't flinch. She didn't react with anger. She simply looked them in the eye. "You're insulting a man who once protected this country. And that dog, he deserves more respect than anything you've said since walking in." The diner went completely still. The young server stood frozen behind the counter. David turned his head slightly. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, he looked directly at Elia. And in his eyes there was something hard to describe. Surprise, maybe. Or quiet gratitude. Or perhaps a memory stirred awake by someone else's voice. The taller man narrowed his eyes. "You think that white coat gives you a license to play hero? This your fight?" Elia stepped forward. "It's a public place, and if you're looking to start something, you're welcome to do it outside. I'll call the police." The shorter man stepped closer, his face now flushed, red from the alcohol, from the embarrassment, from rising anger. "Who do you think you are, huh?" Ronan was already on his feet. Tall, steady, his eyes locked onto the man's chest like a blade poised to strike. David hadn't given any command. He hadn't moved. But his expression shifted, focused now, alert. The man stopped mid-step. His eyes met Ronan's, and in that one breathless second, Elia saw it. He flinched. The taller one grabbed his friend's arm. "Let's go. Now." They muttered curses under their breath, but neither looked back as they pushed through the door. It slammed shut behind them. Elia remained standing, breathing hard. Her legs trembled slightly, the adrenaline only now beginning to settle. David looked at her. This time really looked, and nodded once. No words. But in that small gesture was something solid, something true. Ronan sat again, eyes softer now, and his tail brushed gently against David's boot, as if to say, "She's one of the good ones." Elia returned to her seat, her hands still wrapped around a coffee cup, long gone cold, for the first time in months, standing up, without anyone asking her to. Felt like something that mattered. And what she couldn't know was that this moment, this quiet defiance, would lead her life down a path she never imagined. As the door closed behind the two men, the diner settled into a stillness of a different kind. Not awkward or tense, but relieved. Light. Elia stayed seated, her fingers resting on the cooling ceramic. She didn't know whether what she'd done was brave or foolish, but her heart was still racing, as if trying to chase away the lingering echoes of that confrontation. From the bar, David placed a hand gently on Ronan's head before turning his body. For the first time, he truly looked at her. It wasn't a stare meant to dissect or judge, but one that told her plainly, "I saw everything." He stood slowly and began walking toward her table. Ronan followed at his side, every step in sync, like a shadow formed over years of loyalty. The server behind the counter let out a quiet sigh, like letting go of something heavy. David stopped at her table, his voice low but steady. "Miss, thank you." Just 2 words. But in them, Elia felt the weight of a long life behind quiet walls. She gave a small nod and smiled, tired but warm. "I just couldn't watch that happen. People like them think they can say whatever they want. To anyone." David didn't respond right away. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, hands resting calmly on his knees. His eyes drifted to the window, still watching, as if his body never stopped scanning the edges of the world. Ronan settled beside him, casting a glance at Elia before turning back toward the door. Ever the guardian, even when peace returned. "Your dog, Ronan, right?" she asked. David nodded simply. "Served with me in the Middle East. He's retired now. But his mind, his instinct, it never really leaves." Elia tilted her head slightly, locking eyes with Ronan. There was no menace in that gaze, only awareness. A readiness shaped by war, yet softened by quiet moments like this. "He reminds me of Scout," she whispered. "My father's dog." David said nothing, but his brow lifted slightly, a silent acknowledgement. There was a pause, brief but not uncomfortable. In that moment, Elia felt something align between them. A rhythm of breath shared but unspoken. A kind of understanding that didn't need to be explained. She finished the last sip of her cold coffee, then quietly stood. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, but the streets were still glistening. Pale puddles shimmered under yellow lamplight, streaked and blurred like a watercolor left in the wind. She glanced at the clock. Past 10. Time to go. David rose at the same time. Ronan, too, immediately alert, eyes on the door. It was the rhythm of 2 who had survived things most people couldn't imagine. Always leaving together, never letting the other walk alone. Elia slung her bag over her shoulder, then turned toward him. "Where are you headed? Want me to walk with you a bit?" David raised an eyebrow, surprised by the offer. But his reply was plain dry. "No need." Elia smiled gently. "I'm not doing it out of politeness. I just want to make sure you get home safe, even if it's just a block or 2. He looked at her again, a little longer this time, then nodded, slowly, with a hint of something almost like respect. "In that case, lead the way." They stepped outside together, the bell over the door chiming one last time, softer now, like a quiet closing to a chapter. The night air hit them sharp and cold. The scent of wet asphalt mingled with the earthy dampness of rain-soaked concrete, a scent uniquely city-bound. Elia walked slowly beside David, saying nothing. Only the soft squelch of wet shoes and the steady, deliberate rhythm of Ronan's steps accompanied them. The dog walked closest to the curb, as if shielding the other 2 from the wind. They turned down a narrow alley, dimly lit by a flickering street lamp at the far end. The puddles mirrored pale yellow light, and the silence was so complete that Elia could hear single raindrops falling from rooftops, hitting the asphalt below with soft, hollow notes. She turned to David, about to ask where he lived, when hurried footsteps echoed from up ahead. All three stopped at once. Ronan's ears shot up, his body shifting with startling precision. Elia saw the outlines of two figures just beyond the alley corner, figures she had assumed had left long ago. It was them. The same two men who had stormed out of the diner now stood blocking the narrow path, their bodies heavy with unfinished venom. The shorter one, eyes bloodshot, smirked darkly. "So you're walking home with your little nurse girl, huh? Thought you'd stay in that warm booth forever." David said nothing, but instinctively stepped forward, one arm gently pushing Elia behind him. The taller man whispered, "Old dog's gonna learn when it's time to lie down." Elia opened her mouth. But the glint of a blade caught the light just before the words formed. And in that split second, the quiet they'd been walking through shattered into chaos. Footsteps clapped against the alley walls. Rainwater flickered like ghostly fire under jaundiced streetlights. The cold air clung to their skin, but it was no longer winter's chill. It was the suffocating breath of violence about to erupt. Elia's eyes caught the flash of steel and the rage in bloodshot eyes, and her body reacted before her mind could fully register the threat. "Move!" The man shouted, his voice a slurry of liquor and pent-up fury. David lifted his arm to block the blow, but Elia stepped first. She yanked him backward, pushing Ronan behind her, and then threw herself in front of them both. Her breath caught in her throat, but her feet stayed planted. "Back off!" Elia shouted, arms spread wide in a shield, her voice fierce despite the tremor. The blade sliced through the damp air. It tore into her coat, piercing into her left side. The sound, soft and dull, ripped through her like thunder. She stumbled, eyes wide, yet her arms stayed outstretched, shielding David and Ronan. She saw the man pull the knife free, quick, casual, like tearing through paper. The second man lunged from the side, slashing her shoulder. Blood soaked into the collar of her white coat. She gasped, vision blurring, but refused to fall. Then Ronan growled. A deep, guttural roar, raw and violent, that split the air like a war drum. His body tensed, front paws planted with intent. But David held the short lead tight, pulling back, voice calm but sharp. "Ronan, stand down." The third strike hit her abdomen. Elia folded inward, a cry locked in her chest. Her senses collapsed into the point of impact, where steel met skin, where her warmth began to spill. Her vision danced. Buildings swayed like waves in a storm. She turned to see David. He took a step, but stopped. Ronan was shaking with restraint, one move from launching. If David let go, there would be blood. And not only the attackers. Elia, David cried out, his voice breaking the silence for the first time. The fourth blow cut across her thigh. She collapsed to one knee, arms still extended, trembling fingers pushing the attacker away. The fifth strike came in a jagged line, from her rib cage down to her abdomen. Blood surged, ran down her pant leg, pooling on the cold, wet concrete. She fell, like a leaf severed from the branch, her body folding toward the ground. And then Ronan moved. He tore free from David's grasp with a force that cracked the air. A blur of fur and fury, Ronan launched himself forward, every muscle honed by years of training. His paws scraped the pavement, water and gravel scattering behind him. His roar cut through the alley like thunder through smoke. The man holding the knife turned too late. Ronan hit him mid-step, sent him sprawling. His jaws locked around the attacker's arm, crushing the muscle with brutal precision. A scream echoed off the brick walls. The man collapsed into a puddle, blood spraying against the alley wall. Windows creaked open. Someone shouted from the corner store. A woman screamed, "Someone's been stabbed!" David ran, dropping to his knees beside Elia. His hands trembled, but his movements were steady. He grabbed cloth pressed against the bleeding. His eyes locked on hers, and in that moment he saw her smile. Faint, pale, but still a smile. "Is the boy okay?" she whispered, her voice thin, broken. David understood. She meant Ronan. He nodded. "He's okay, but right now we're focusing on you." Blood kept flowing. Footsteps approached from the far end of the alley. Someone rushed forward, a phone in one hand, flashlight beam sweeping across pavement stained with rain and red. "She's bleeding." "Call an ambulance," someone shouted. Ronan had returned. He sat beside her, his chest heaving, his eyes filled not with rage, but with sorrow. He pressed his head gently against her trembling arm. No one tried to move him. His gaze no longer roared. It mourned. In his eyes, the woman bleeding beneath him wasn't a stranger. She was something he'd claimed, someone he would not abandon. David held her hand tightly. "Stay with me." "Help's almost here," he said. A promise spoken not with certainty, but with the need to believe. In the darkness, Elia whispered, barely air, "Don't let him go back." David's heart twisted. He didn't know if she meant the alley or war or someplace deeper. Ronan had barely escaped, but he understood. She was afraid Ronan would be pulled back into a world of violence, a world he had already given too much to. And so David promised silently but completely that he wouldn't let that happen. Sirens wailed in the distance. Red and blue light began to flicker through the alley mouth. Ronan remained by her side, watching, guarding. And in that rain-drenched corridor, among shattered breath and spilled blood, one life began to fade, but what remained was a testament to loyalty witnessed in silence and sacrifice etched into every heartbeat. The sound of the blade being pulled from Elia's body sliced through the air like the tearing of fate itself. She collapsed onto the wet concrete, leaving behind a streak of blood that spread out like a fallen flag on a battlefield. And in that very moment, when her small frame crumpled, when her eyes hadn't yet closed, Ronan rose. Gone was the restrained gaze. Gone was the composed, steady stance. Nothing held him back now. His growl erupted like a detonation. Ronan launched forward, without hesitation, without pause, an unleashed storm in motion. His powerful body surged from the ground, all strength channeled into his limbs, his golden eyes ablaze, ears standing high like a soldier summoned from the depths of war. The man with the knife didn't react in time. He turned only to find a mass of black and tan fur rocketing toward him, teeth glinting under the streetlight wind ripping against his face. Ronan slammed into his chest, sending the attacker sprawling onto his back. The knife flew from his hand, spinning once before clattering to the ground with a final sharp thud, like a verdict. But it wasn't over. Ronan pinned him, front paws dug into his chest jaws, locking onto the arm that had stabbed Elia. The man screamed, a screeching, desperate sound, panic rising like steam. Blood poured from the wound streaking Ronan's chest fur. But the dog didn't flinch. He didn't blink. The chaos echoed through the alley. Windows flew open. Lights from second and third-story apartments spilled downward. Voices called out, "What's happening? Someone's hurt. There's a fight." An old man peeked out through a gate shouting, "Call the police!" A young man in a gray hoodie sprinted to the alley's end, phone pressed to his ear, voice sharp and urgent. "A woman's been stabbed. There's a K9 on scene. It's holding down the attacker. The address is..." Footsteps rushed in from every direction. A schoolboy dropped his backpack and ran to help. A woman from the diner appeared, clutching napkins and a spare coat, eyes wide with disbelief. David knelt beside Elia, hands pressed tightly over her wounds. Wind rushed through the alley, blowing his silver hair back, revealing a face carved by years, and now twisted in pure focus. He didn't look up. He didn't allow his hands to tremble, not for a second more. A broad-shouldered man emerged, the mechanic from the corner shop. He spotted the second thug still backing away in shock, hand over his mouth. "Grab him," someone yelled. Without hesitation, the mechanic lunged, grabbing the man in a firm lock. The attacker struggled weakly, slipping on wet pavement before falling to his knees. "Stay down," the man barked. "Cops are on their way." A woman stepped forward, someone who once worked at a nearby animal shelter. She understood the look in Ronan's eyes. Slowly, she extended her hand sideways, non-threatening, offering a silent message. "You don't have to fight anymore. I'm here to help." But Ronan still stood guard over the fallen attacker, Hackle's raised blood still dripping from his muzzle. He refused to look away until David spoke. "Ronan, release." Just one word, and Ronan let go. He stepped back 3 paces and sat beside Elia, his body soaked in blood, some from the man who attacked, some from the woman he had protected. Flashing lights finally appeared at the end of the alley. Sirens pierced the air, shattering what little silence remained. An ambulance and 2 police cruisers screeched to a stop. Doors flew open. Medics rushed toward Elia. "She's still breathing," one of them shouted. David raised his hand. "I've dressed the wounds. 5 stab points, 1 to the lower abdomen, 1 to the shoulder, 1 to the side, most bleeding from the 3rd. A young paramedic nodded, applying pressure, signaling for the stretcher. Another fitted an oxygen mask, checking vitals. Elia whimpered faintly, eyes still closed. David rose to give them space, his eyes following every movement. Ronan paced beside the stretcher, unwilling to leave her side. A police officer lifted a hand. "Hold the dog back." David's voice cut in, calm but with the authority of someone who had once commanded storms. "He's a retired K-9, and tonight he saved her life." The officer froze. He looked again, this time truly seeing Ronan. The dog walked slowly beside the stretcher head, lowered eyes locked on Elia, as though watching part of his soul being carried away. "Let him come," the officer said quietly. Another team of officers handcuffed the 2 attackers. One lay face down, restrained with no resistance. The other trembled, blood drying on his sleeves and collar, too shocked to protest. They were dragged toward the police car, no sympathy given. David remained alone in the blood-stained alley. Wind tugged at his coat. His silver hair whipped about his face as he watched the ambulance pull away, its red and blue lights spinning across the wet pavement like a heartbeat flaring against the dark. And on that night, amid sirens and slamming doors as neighbors slowly drifted back indoors, a 4-legged soldier had charged like a storm to shield a life. The ambulance sped into the freezing night. Above, the clouds split into jagged gray. Even the sky seemed to hold its breath. Inside the softly lit cabin, Elia lay on her right side facing the wall, her skin pale, soaked in sweat and blood, her blouse stained through. One hand rested over her abdomen. Or maybe it was just her trying to hold on to something that was slipping away second by second. "Pressure's dropping," one medic muttered. "Heart rate 110, now 94. Get the IV started. O2 ready. Hang in there." The beeping of machines echoed, steadily, urgently, like drums marking the passing of time. Elia blinked. Barely. Her pupils trembled under heavy lids. Each breath was a battle. She heard fragments. Sirens, a name shouted, a warm hand pressing against hers before vanishing again. Disjointed sounds, fading in and out. But through the haze, one image stayed. Not the flashing lights, not the alley, but Ronan's eyes. That look. Fierce, full of sorrow, unwavering. The last thing she saw before the dark pulled her under. In the corner of the ambulance, Ronan lay still, his large frame curled into a crescent head resting gently against the metal bar of the vehicle. No one told him to enter. No one dared to pull him back. One of the nurses, who had once worked in a PTSD support program, understood. She didn't intervene. She simply turned to her colleague and whispered, "Don't make him leave. That dog is holding on to what's still keeping her here." The ambulance halted in front of the emergency bay. The doors flung open, and the cold night air rushed in, sharpening every movement. 2 on the stretcher, 1 on vitals. "Let's move." Elia was rushed out, EIV bag swaying above her. Ronan walked tightly beside the stretcher. He didn't bark, didn't panic, but his gaze was razor-sharp, as if reading every beat of the fading heart beside him. As they neared the ICU entrance, 2 nurses stepped forward to stop them. "Family stops here." David exhaled, his body still trembling. He placed a hand against the ICU doorframe, eyes fixed on the stretcher as it vanished behind a curtain of white. He said nothing, just stood there, his gaze frozen heavy with things he could no longer control. A hospital security guard gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll notify you as soon as we hear anything. Please, you should sit down." David nodded faintly and shuffled over to a bench against the wall, lowering himself slowly, hands resting on his knees like a soldier waiting for orders. Ronan didn't follow him. The German Shepherd turned back to the ICU door, sitting upright. His eyes locked on the hallway inside, where lights remained bright and every doctor's footstep echoed with urgency. A nurse moved to stop him, but hesitated. An older doctor walked by, noticed the unmoving figure. A German Shepherd, upright and silent like a sentinel at the threshold between life and something deeper. The doctor nodded once. Let him stay. He knows where he needs to be. So Ronan stayed. The doors opened and closed repeatedly, nurses and surgeons passing through. But he didn't move. His back stayed straight, ears tilted forward. And each time the curtain inside fluttered. Even just from a breeze or a passing figure, his gaze followed. Searching, asking, is she still breathing? Is she coming back? Inside the ICU, Elia was transferred to the operating table. 3 surgeons and 2 nurses surrounded her. Her body began to drift in and out of consciousness, caught in that thin veil between knowing and nothing. The beeping of the heart monitor slowed, reduced to a faint rhythm, barely holding on against the clang of metal instruments and clipped commands. A surgeon frowned. 3rd wounds deep, pierced the pleura. We're seeing signs of hemothorax. Elia, can you hear me? Another voice. A woman, this time the anesthesiologist. Elia didn't answer, but one of her fingers moved, just barely. It wasn't clear if it was conscious or reflex, but it was something. A fragile thread trying not to break. Out in the hallway, David checked his watch. Each minute stretched like an hour. He said nothing, didn't look up. He sat like a man stationed at a war post, waiting for the signal, praying for none. Ronan was no longer sitting. He had lain down, paws stretched forward, chin flat against the cold white tile. His eyes never closed, never wandered. A little girl passed by holding her mother's hand. She pointed, "Mommy, who's that dog waiting for?" The mother held her daughter closer. Maybe he's waiting for someone he loves to come back out through that door. And so the night crept on. Among the hum of ventilators, the steady beeping of heart monitors, and the soft shuffle of rubber soles, Ronan waited. A dog without a name on a chart, without legal permission, without a voice. But somehow he was doing what no one else could, holding on to the last fragile breath of a woman beyond the doors, using only presence. Using only eyes that refused to let go. Inside the sterile world of the ICU, fluorescent light washed everything in cold blue-white. Warmth had no place here. Every surface gleamed. Every sound echoed. The room felt like it feared touch. On the table, Elia's small body lay nearly swallowed by wires, fuse, and blinking monitors. She looked impossibly small beneath it all. The heart monitor's steady beeping was the only thing that marked time. Heartbeat, life, hope. One doctor, gray-haired and stooped slightly, glasses slipping low on his nose, studied the screen and nodded grimly. Third wound caused pulmonary bleeding. The fifth sliced through the abdominal wall. We need to close her up. Now. He didn't finish the sentence, didn't have to. He simply gestured. The nurses moved quickly, handing him what was needed. Blood still seeped from beneath the surgical drapes, pooling in dark patches on the fabric. No one flinched. They didn't see themselves as professionals in that moment. Not doctors, not nurses, not techs. They were guardians of a silent vow. Anyone who throws themselves between danger and another deserves a chance to fight their way back. A young female doctor tightened her grip on the surgical clamp in her hand, her voice hoarse. "Elia, don't you go anywhere. We're still here." Just outside the ICU. Door opened for a brief moment. Angela, the brunette nurse who had worked alongside Elia for 3 years, entered in full PPE. Behind her walked Sam, the resident, who had often argued with Elia over triage decisions. Tonight there was no debate, only presence, and a quiet, trembling hand. Angela approached the table without a word. She gently laid her hand over Elia's, still stained with dried blood. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She just held on as if letting go would mean Elia would drift too far to bring back. Sam stood behind her. He took a deep breath, then stepped back again, afraid that if he moved any closer, the tears forming in his eyes might fall. And if they did, it might make the others believe hope was slipping. Then the monitor let out a sharp, different tone. "Heart rate's dropping," a nurse yelled. "Another unit of blood. Check cranial pressure." Angela flinched, her eyes locked on the screen, devouring every number. Sam stepped closer, hands clenched inside his coat pockets. He looked at Elia, then whispered, low-like in a chapel. "You once told me no one is allowed to leave mid-shift, so now it's your turn to keep that promise." No one lifted their head, but every single person heard. A nurse pushed a new IV line, another adjusted the ventilator, and across their foreheads, sweat began to bead. Despite the cold room, in that fleeting moment, everyone in the operating room understood silence does not always mean surrender. Sometimes silence is the deepest form of resistance. It is when a body on the verge of collapse continues to fight. Not with screams, but with the quiet rhythm of a slowing heart, with breath so fragile it trembles between staying and slipping away. And then, something shifted. The heart rate monitor ticked up, just one beat faster. The beeping quickened. The lead surgeon's eyes lifted. "She's responding," he announced. Angela was still holding Elia's hand. She felt it, just a faint curl of the fingers, like a breeze brushing across her skin. "Sam," she whispered. "She just squeezed my hand." Sam nodded. "And we've never let go." The surgeon exhaled as though setting down a weight that had been crushing his chest. He turned to the nurse at his side, signaling to begin closing the wound. She made it past the first threshold. Now it's time. And resilience. When the bleeding had been stabilized and the first phase complete, Angela was asked to step outside. She removed her gloves, stripped off her surgical cover, and stepped into the hallway where David still sat. Unchanged, still in the same position, his hands resting on his knees. Ronan lay beside the wall, eyes still fixed on the ICU door. Angela bent down and gently stroked the top of Ronan's head. The first time she had touched him since receiving the message that read Elia was stabbed while defending a veteran and his dog. Ronan tilted his head slightly as if listening. "She's still fighting," Angela whispered. just like you fought to keep her here." Down the corridor, fluorescent lights still glowed overhead. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered. And in the vastness of the hospital, where lives rose and fell with each tick of the second hand, there remained one white room, where silence did not mean defeat, but rather a promise, clinging to life even with the faintest breath. At the far end of the intensive care hallway, outside the glass door labeled ICU, David remained seated. He hadn't changed posture in hours. Hands still on his knees, back slightly hunched, eyes locked into a space no one else could see, as though reading prophecy in the cold hue of the overhead lights. The veteran who had once faced mortar fire, hidden mines, and frigid desert dawns shattered by the screams of comrades, now sat in a quiet hospital corridor feeling smaller than ever before. Something inside him tightened, layer by layer, as if a cord was pulling inward with each minute. Helplessness, grief, guilt, emotions he thought he'd buried in the past now returned in waves, filling him to the brim. On the floor, Ronan lay curled with his head resting between his paws. His eyes were open, but unfocused. Each time a figure passed the ICU door, nurse or doctor, Ronan would let out a soft, low growl. Not loud, not threatening, just enough to say, "Don't come near unless you have a reason to be here." A janitor hesitated with a mop in hand, glanced at Ronan's tense form, and backed away slowly. A senior nurse nearby simply said, "Let him be. He knows what he's guarding." David leaned down, laid a hand gently on Ronan's back fingers, moving along the ridge of his spine. "She's still alive," he murmured. "You know that, don't you?" Ronan didn't respond. His body remained tight like a string pulled to its final note, humming with pressure, but never breaking. The faint swish of a curtain inside the ICU drew David's eyes upward. For a split second his heart lifted, but nothing changed. The door stayed closed. Elia still hadn't woken. In David's mind, the image of Elia falling, blood trailing behind her like spilled light, remained frozen. He had seen such things in war. He had lost men who walked beside him. But nothing had pierced him like watching her collapse. A young woman, a stranger, no obligation, no shared past. And yet, she had stepped forward into danger, placing her body between him, a worn-out veteran, and a dog the world had nearly forgotten. Because of that, Ronan's silence only made the ache sharper. The dog didn't whimper, didn't cry, didn't pull at anyone's pant leg. He just remained, like a living statue carved from memory, loyalty, and sorrow. At one point, a female doctor passed by and paused. She lowered herself beside David, her voice calm and deep. "You were with the young woman who was stabbed." David nodded. "She's stable," the doctor said. "Still critical, but we've stopped the bleeding and managed the lung injury. Now, we wait for her body to respond." David tightened his jaw. "I don't think I have the right words to say thank you." The doctor gave a faint smile, then looked down at Ronan. "This dog, was he a service dog?" David gave a quiet nod. "Served with me on the southern border. Retired now. But I think that part of him never retired." She placed a hand on David's shoulder before standing. "Some things don't need retraining," she said. "They live deep in the heart," and with that she walked away, leaving David and Ronan in a space where time wasn't measured in seconds, but in the fragile, rhythmic breaths behind a closed door. Angela returned not long after. She was no longer in surgical gear. Her blouse bore patches of dried blood. As soon as she saw them, she dropped to the bench beside David, eyes rimmed red. "We've done everything we can," she said softly. "Now, it's up to time." David looked at her, and for the first time since he had entered the hospital, His eyes glistened. "She's strong," he rasped. "And I think he's still holding her here." Angela turned to look at Ronan. The dog hadn't moved. His gaze remained fixed on the gap between the ICU doors. A gust from the hallway brushed through his fur, ruffling it slightly. Still, he didn't stir. Angela reached out, resting a hand gently on David's shoulder. "I've never seen a dog wait for a human like this." David nodded and said nothing. The lights inside the ICU remained bright, but the hallway outside had grown quiet. It was well past midnight now, and most of the hospital had settled into a hush. But at the end of that corridor, where a war veteran and an aging German shepherd still sat vigil outside the room that held the line between life and death, there was a silence as solid as stone. No sobbing, no panic, no pleading, only steadfastness. And Ronan's eyes, unblinking, remained fixed on the door, watching over the girl who had once stepped between him and a knife, as if he was repaying a debt that had never been asked for. Just hours after Elia's surgery, while the night outside was still thick with mist, a ripple began spreading across social media faster than brush fire in dry wind. Young nurse stabbed 5 times while protecting veteran and K9 in Portland Alley. No one could say exactly who posted the first account, but the photos spoke louder than any caption. A stretcher rolling out of a narrow alley, a young woman's bloodied hand still clutching the edge. And next to her, moving with quiet resolve, was a black and tan German shepherd, his eyes burning bright against the rain-streaked night. Just one line accompanied the image. They said she was a nurse. But to me, she was a shield. Between the knife and the darkness, she chose to stand for someone else's life. The story exploded. On Reddit, the comments came fast. "That dog looks like a warrior. Anyone know his background? If she makes it through, I'm putting her name on my helmet." I served. I know what it means when someone steps up even when no one asks them to. On Twitter, hashtags began to appear: Elia Tran, #Guardian with no badge, and most strikingly, Silent Flame. Veterans from around the country began sharing her story. Not because she was a nurse, but because her actions spoke to something they all once believed: no one gets left behind. At a small gas station near Spokane, Washington, nearly 400 kilometers from Portland, a bald man with a silver beard sat sipping black coffee when his phone buzzed. The screen lit up veteran David Briggs and K9 Ronan attacked, saved by young nurse. He looked up, eyes sharpening. He didn't need to read more. The name Ronan was enough. He stood up, pulled out an old phone, opened a long inactive group chat. Silent Flame. Tom Callahan Ronan. Portland. Need confirmation. Minutes later, the thread exploded. Martha L. Medic Recon confirmed. It's him. That mark behind his left ear. It's Ronan. Julian Handler. 3. That dog saved my arm and my life. I'm on the road. Benny Tech Spec K9. Just tell me which hospital. Portland Medical Center. Within 30 minutes, all 28 members of Silent Flame had responded. They were former soldiers, medics, dog handlers. People who had once served in the harshest places, borders, deserts, forgotten outposts. They had slept in sand trenches, eaten dry rations for weeks, held the hands of dying comrades. And each one had at some point been saved by Ronan. Through a bark, a pounce, or sometimes just a well-timed growl in the darkness. No one needed orders. No one asked permission. They all typed the same thing. On my way. At a K9 recovery unit near Boise, Idaho, a silver-haired woman was training a new shepherd pup when the alert popped up on her screen. She dropped the leash and ran inside, heart pounding. On her computer, she pulled up the image. Elia on the stretcher, Ronan beside her. That same look. Tears broke free. She collapsed onto the desk, forehead pressed to her folded hands. For a moment, she wasn't an instructor. She was just someone who once lifted Ronan off a minefield 7 years ago when his rear leg was torn and bleeding. She posted one short message alongside the photo. Heroes don't always wear armor. Some people, and some dogs, just walk into danger when no one else will, and still choose to do what's right. Back in Portland at the hospital, the head nurse began to notice something strange. The emergency line rang non-stop, not from family members, but from veteran organizations, rescue shelters, even local news outlets. Every call carried the same questions. Is it true she shielded a soldier? Is the dog's name really? Ronan? Is she still alive? Angela, resting in the staff room, stared at her phone with tears streaming freely. The latest message read, "She did what hundreds of us, saved by Ronan, can never forget. Please let us do something for her." And outside the ICU, David still hadn't moved. But for the first time in nearly 24 hours, he reached for his phone, opened an old group thread, and typed, "David Briggs." She stepped in to protect someone who used to be the shield. "If you can, let her know we're still here." Ronan remained by the door. His eyes, aged but unwavering, stayed locked on the line between life and whatever waited beyond. And somewhere in that stillness, something had begun to stir again. Like an ember deep in the ashes, like memory carried by wind, like a promise not yet forgotten. From that moment on, the name Elia, a nurse who had never set foot on a battlefield, became something more. A symbol of what every soldier once hoped to find in another, the final shield. The one who doesn't step back when the darkness comes. Morning hadn't fully arrived yet. But on the outskirts of Portland, the city began to stretch beneath the weight of a damp spring dawn. Fog clung low to the asphalt. Streetlights still glowed a pale tarnished yellow, reflected in puddles from last night's storm. And in that chilled morning air, the first pickup truck pulled into the hospital parking lot. A tall man stepped out wearing a faded khaki jacket. On his wrist, a worn cloth bracelet read, Unit 43, South Border. He said nothing, just lowered his cap and walked toward the main entrance. Minutes later, a mud-covered SUV rolled in. A short-haired woman stepped out, her posture, unshakable boots hitting the ground with a quiet authority. An old Army Medical Corps badge clung to her chest. She scanned the hospital entrance once, then headed forward. No need for directions, and so they came, one by one. No one needed a call. No one asked who was in charge. They arrived the way people who had known life and death tend to do, quiet, precise, and resolute. Veterans, recently discharged soldiers, even those once listed as unfit for redeployment due to psychological trauma, they all showed up. And in their eyes, they carried the same thing, gratitude. By 6:00 a.m., more than 20 people stood outside the ICU. There was no pushing, no noise. They stood with arms crossed, eyes fixed on the door at the end of the hallway, where a young woman was fighting to stay alive, and an old German shepherd was keeping watch without blinking. Angela had just finished her night shift and hadn't yet taken a full sip of her morning coffee when another nurse pulled her out into the corridor. "You need to see this." When the door swung open, Angela froze. Along the long hallway, on wooden benches pressed against the wall, unfamiliar faces sat quietly. Statues in human form. None wore uniforms, but their posture, their eyes, their stillness. They all spoke the same language. Each carried a subtle mark of military life, a worn silver dog tag dangling from a backpack, a faded patch on a cap, or a tattoo blurred with age. Silent flame. Angela whispered, "Who are they?" The other nurse replied, "They're the ones Ronan once saved, or fought beside. They said they're here to wait with him." Angela covered her mouth as her eyes filled. She slowly stepped forward and caught the gaze of an older man, a retired officer from Texas. He tilted his head in a small salute, then quietly said, "We owe that girl a thank you." No one needed to call us. Ronan already did. Inside the ICU, David hadn't moved. His eyes were sunken, but his spine remained straight. At his feet, Ronan lay motionless, still in the exact position since the night before. A doctor passed by, caught a glimpse of Ronan's eyes, tired yet unwavering, and turned away, unable to speak. David gently stroked Ronan's back, murmuring, "How long have we been waiting now, buddy?" Ronan flicked an ear in response, offering no sound. But he knew. He was guarding the one who had shielded him, just as he once did on a border post years ago, when a young soldier collapsed under fire and Ronan had been the last one standing in the crossfire. Footsteps echoed from the end of the hall. Then came a deep voice. "There he is." David looked up. A broad man in a heavy coat with a beard and a large thermos in hand walked toward him. Without waiting for permission, the man sat beside him and placed the thermos down. "Brought you this. I once swore if Ronan made it through that border ambush, I'd come see him again." He leaned down, patting Ronan's side. "And you beat me to it, old boy." David looked around and finally realized the hallway was no longer empty. Silent figures stood like statues. Some leaned against walls. One pulled out a tin box and shared a few dry biscuits. A former medic opened a personal first aid pouch and gently placed a wildflower on a table near the ICU door, as if performing a silent rite. No one spoke loudly, but each one carried fragments of memory, running through gunfire, guarding lonely borders, tracking trails in craggy terrain, and a dog who once pressed his nose into their trembling palms to say, "I'm here. I'll get you home." The chief ICU doctor had planned to check in with David, but he stopped at the corridor's entrance. Under the pale hospital light, he saw the row of people stretching down the hallway. They didn't speak. They didn't cry out names. They didn't ask for access or favors. They simply stood present, with profound reverence. And among them was an aging veteran, an old German shepherd, and a closed ICU door, behind which a young woman was holding on to her last flicker of light. In that silence, presence became the loudest form of gratitude. They hadn't come out of duty. No one summoned them, but they were here because someone had shielded the life of one who once saved theirs. And that's something every soldier understands. No one gets left behind. No one. By 8:00 a.m., staff at Portland Medical Center began to sense it. Something had shifted. The atmosphere was heavier, slower, like the heartbeat of the hospital itself had paused. Some young nurses paused at the glass atrium of the main lobby and stopped in their tracks. Outside, along the hospital perimeter, a formation was taking shape. One by one they arrived, wearing dark coats, black tactical boots, holding their hats in hand, eyes unwavering. No one pushed. No one spoke. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a silent arc around the main building. They were Navy SEALs, the most elite Special Operations Force veterans of missions the world would never know. And today, they weren't here for a mission. They didn't carry weapons. They carried only memory, and a promise made long ago. At the head of that formation stood Logan Reeves, now retired, living in the Oregon mountains. 12 years earlier, during a cross-border operation, he'd been buried in a collapsed pit. It was Ronan, only 2 years old then, who caught his faint signal beneath the rubble, allowing the team to dig him out in the final minutes. Logan had nearly passed out that day, but he still remembered in the haze Ronan's eyes. Steady, unmistakable, saying something no human language could. "I see you. I will hold on." So when he learned that a young nurse had thrown herself between Ronan and danger, Logan couldn't stay away. He sent a single message to his old unit's private channel: "Ronan was one of ours. That girl is the one who protected our last teammate." Within an hour, hundreds of replies came flooding in. Now from across the states, Nevada, Arizona, Idaho, Washington, former SEAL teams converged. No banners, no commands. Just one thing: organized silence. And so, one by one, they arrived. No one gave orders. No one needed a call. They simply came, in the way those who have truly lived often do. Orderly, silent, but certain. Veterans, freshly discharged soldiers, even those once deemed psychologically unfit for redeployment, showed up, each carrying in their gaze the same thing: gratitude. By 6 a.m., over 20 people were standing outside the ICU. There was no jostling, no sound. They stood with arms folded, eyes fixed on the door at the end of the hallway, the one behind which a young woman was fighting to stay alive, and an old dog waited without blinking. Angela had just left the on-call room after her night shift. She hadn't even finished her first sip of coffee when another nurse pulled her into the hallway. "You should see this." As the door opened, Angela stopped cold. Along the long corridor, seated on wooden benches against the wall, were faces she had never seen before, still and quiet as statues. No one wore uniforms, but the way they sat, the set of their shoulders, the look in their eyes, all spoke the same language. Each person bore a subtle relic of military life: a faded dog tag hanging from a backpack, a worn patch on a ball cap, or a weathered tattoo nearly erased by time. Silent flame. Angela whispered, "Who are they?" The nurse replied softly, "People Ronan saved, or those who once served beside him. They said they're here to wait with him." Angela covered her mouth, eyes stinging. As she stepped closer, she caught the gaze of an older man, a retired officer from Texas. He gave her a small nod, then spoke quietly. "We owe that girl a thank you. No one needed to call us. Ronan already did." Inside the ICU, David remained in the same chair. His eyes were darkened with fatigue, but his posture was still upright. At his feet, Ronan lay still. He hadn't moved since the night before. A passing doctor caught Ronan's gaze, tired yet alert, and quickly looked away, saying nothing. David gently stroked Ronan's back. "How long have we been waiting, boy?" Ronan flicked an ear slightly. He didn't answer, but he knew. He was standing guard for the one who had shielded him, just as he once had at a border post years ago when a young soldier collapsed and he alone had stayed upright under gunfire. Footsteps echoed from down the hall. Then a deep voice spoke from the far end. "There he is." David looked up. A bearded man in a thick coat approached, holding a large thermos of coffee. Without asking, he sat beside David and placed the thermos down. "Brought you something. I once swore that if Ronan survived that border op, I'd see him again." He leaned down, gently tapped Ronan's side. "And you beat me to it, buddy." David glanced around. Only then did he realize the hallway was no longer empty. People stood still as stone. A few leaned against the walls. Someone passed around a tin of old biscuits. A retired field nurse set a single wildflower down on a table near the ICU door, like a silent ritual. No one spoke loudly. Yet each person carried a memory of running through gunfire, of border night watches, of mountain tracking operations, of a dog who once pressed his nose to their palm as if to say, "I'm here. I'll bring you home." The head of the ICU stepped into the hall intending to speak with David. But he stopped in his tracks when he saw the line of figures bathed in the pale glow of fluorescent lights. They didn't cry names. They didn't ask for favors. They came and stood, with quiet, deep respect, and among them an aging veteran, an old German shepherd, and the sealed ICU door, behind which a young woman was fighting to keep her light alive. In that silence, presence was the loudest form of gratitude. No one had summoned them. No orders had been issued. They came. For someone who shielded the life of a being who had once saved theirs. And that every soldier understood no one gets left behind. Not one soul. By 8 a.m., something had shifted in Portland General Hospital. The atmosphere turned solemn slower, as if daily life had pressed pause. Several young nurses peered through the tall front windows and froze. Outside, lining the perimeter fence, a formation was taking shape. One by one, dressed in dark coats, wearing black tactical boots, holding caps in hand. They didn't speak, didn't push. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a quiet, unbreakable arc around the hospital's main building. They were Navy SEALs, elite soldiers who had once taken on missions the world would never know. And today, they weren't here for an op. They carried no weapons, only memories, and an old promise. At the front stood Logan Reeves, long retired and living in the Oregon mountains. 12 years ago, during a border sweep mission, he was buried under a collapsed trench. Ronan, then a 2-year-old pup, picked up the faintest signal beneath the rubble and led the team to pull Logan out just in time. Logan had nearly faded out that day. But in the haze, he remembered Ronan's eyes. Calm, certain, like a voice that needed no words. I see you. I'll hold you here. So when he heard a young nurse had thrown herself in front of a blade to protect that same dog and his handler, Logan couldn't stay home. He sent a single message to their old unit group chat. Ronan was our teammate. That girl protected our last teammate. Within an hour, hundreds of responses poured in. Now, from Nevada, Arizona, Idaho, Washington, SEALs gathered. No banners, no slogans. Only one thing bound them: organized silence. Passers-by stared. Some stopped, some recorded. A few journalists began tailing the story. But none of the SEALs looked at the cameras. They stood expressionless, as if their very presence was building a wall holding back the noise of the world to preserve a sacred quiet for Elia, the girl still clinging to life inside. A delivery driver arrived, stunned at the scene. He turned to a gate officer and asked, "What's going on?" "Why are all these SEALs here?" The officer replied softly. "They're standing guard for a nurse, the one who used her body to shield their old teammate." The young man nodded, set down his package, and pulled off his cap, as though standing before a living monument. Upstairs, from a break room window, Angela watched with tear-brimmed eyes, hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. One by one, she whispered, "No orders, no calls." But they came, just as Elia stepped in front of that blade without waiting for permission. Sam, the resident doctor, stood beside her, gripping the railing. This isn't mourning. This is honor. A living wall, saying, "You're not alone." David stepped from the ICU corridor posture, straight as a soldier, never truly dismissed. From the lobby window, he saw them. Men and women who once wore ranks, now standing silent in the winter chill. He paused, hand over his heart. No one saluted him. But as he and Ronan approached the hospital's main entrance, those nearest bowed their heads, slow, solemn, as if greeting a former commander. He nodded back, silent. Ronan walked with measured steps, his hind legs no longer nimble, but his eyes held the same glint, the light of one who had learned to live in danger and now watched sacrifice returned. One young SEAL stepped forward quietly, removed his team insignia, and placed it in David's hand. "For her," he said. "She doesn't wear rank, but she carries something many soldiers lost: courage without command." David closed his hand around the badge, nodded. "I'll give it to her when she wakes." Above them, the sky remained gray, the light faint and dull like brushed lead. Yet within that circle of stillness, among hundreds of faces who had seen blood, fire, and grief, not a single soul wavered. For they knew a battle was underway, silent but fierce. the battle for a life. And by standing here, they had become the unmoving rear guard for a girl who had never even known their names. A wall made not of bricks, but of memory of debt and hearts that never learned to back down. Inside that formless world, no time, no shape, only darkness and jagged silences, Elia drifted trapped between scattered heartbeats and a rhythm that no longer held steady. No one could see the war within. Outside, she lay still in the ICU bed, wrapped in white blankets, eyes closed, skin pale. But inside, in the deepest part of the living soul, she thrashed like a swimmer lost at sea where each heartbeat was a black wave. The beep, beep of the heart monitor pulsed through the room like a slowed requiem. Red and green lines flickered on the screen, fragile ripples of a stubborn life. The lead physician, a man with graying temples, stood watching the chart in silent tension. She's still unresponsive to light stimulation, the nurse reported. But circulation remains stable, he answered slowly. Her heart is still fighting. It wasn't said to comfort, it was fact. A heart that had endured 5 stab wounds, 2 collapses, and an hour-long emergency surgery, and was still refusing to surrender. On the bed, Elia's hand rested softly, bruises from IVs still fresh. A small incision at her neck had been neatly stitched. The same woman who once strode quickly through hospital corridors in a crisp white uniform now lay motionless, like porcelain surrounded by wires and machines. Angela entered carrying a small chair and a gray knit scarf from the staff locker. She sat beside Elia gently, placing her hand over her friend's cold fingers. "They're still outside, Elle," she whispered. "They haven't left. No one called them. And Ronan hasn't closed his eyes." The air conditioning blew cold, but Angela's shiver came from inside. She leaned forward, rested her forehead on the back of Elia's hand, voice trembling. "You once said, if someone dares to step up when no one else does, then that person is doing the right thing. So this time, you have to dare to come back, Elle. You have to dare to open your eyes. This whole city is waiting." Somewhere in the deep stillness, Elia saw a faint light, like a flickering ember over dark waters. She tried to swim toward it, but each time the shadows dragged her back. Then came a sound, tiny like a whisper breaking through water. "You once said, Ronan's still waiting." She didn't know where the voice came from, but it felt real. She began to remember. A diner, an old man, a German shepherd, a narrow alley, a blade, and a growl erupting just before her body fell. Her heart clenched. And in that exact moment, on the heart monitor, the once slow, steady rhythm leapt upward in a single sharp wave. The doctor rushed to the bed, eyes locked on the screen. "She's showing slight reflex. Prepare a low-dose dopamine drip." The nurses moved quickly, rechecking sensors and lines. No one spoke loudly. But everyone in the room knew. Something was changing. In the unconscious dark, Elia felt herself rising toward a patch of light. There was something warm, not from a lamp, but from a presence she knew by heart. She heard breathing, short, steady, and heavy, like the breath of a loyal creature curled close beside her. Ronan. She couldn't see anything, but she felt a touch. Gentle like the tip of a dog's nose nudging a hand, just as she'd seen so many times at the hospital when Ronan leaned into David, or when he laid his head across her lap beneath the cafe counter. And that touch drew her closer to the surface of the waking world. Angela looked up when the heart monitor emitted a quicker rhythm. Circulatory markers climbed slightly. Oxygen saturation held steady. The doctor stifled his breath, stethoscope still pressed to Elia's chest. That's good, he murmured. She's fighting on her own now. Angela grasped Elia's hand, half laughing through tears. You're so stubborn, you know that. Then she whispered, they're still out there. And me. I'll stay right here until you decide to open your eyes. Outside the ICU, David remained where he was. He hadn't slept. Neither had Ronan. But suddenly, as if guided by instinct, the old dog lifted his head, ears sharpening forward. David turned. What is it? Ronan didn't bark. He didn't move frantically. But his eyes lit up. Then he stood, slowly but deliberately, his gaze locked on the ICU doors. David placed a hand on his head, murmuring, You felt it? Didn't you? Ronan kept his eyes fixed on that direction. The place where a young woman was beginning to return from the other side of the line, between life and loss. In a battle with no gunfire, no visible enemies, Elia had just started to strike back. And this time, she wasn't alone. The first light didn't come from the sun, but from a pair of eyes slowly opening beneath lashes that had stayed still for days. Like a sealed door easing open in the quiet after a storm, letting the world be seen again. Through eyes that had once stared down death. In the ICU room, where everything was adjusted to the safest levels, from humidity to lighting to the softness of footsteps. The sound of Elia's heartbeat grew stronger, clearer on the monitor. Vital signs nudged upward, stabilizing with hope. The attending physician, on his fourth straight shift, stepped in on routine. But this time, he stopped. His eyes paused the moment he saw her eyelids tremble. He approached slowly and called softly, Elia. There was no response at first, but a moment later, like a voice from deep underwater, her lids lifted and her pupils moved sluggishly beneath the ambient white light. She blinked. Her lips tightened slightly, as if trying to realign herself with reality. The room fell silent. Angela had just stepped in when she froze mid-stride. Her breath caught. Then she rushed to the bed, tears rushing to the brink of her eyes. Elia. The young woman turned her head, very slowly. Her vision still clouded, but her expression sharpened. Something between surprise pain and peace. Angela gripped her hand, sob-laughing, as her voice cracked. Welcome back to us. Sam appeared from behind, hurrying to the head of the bed, staring into Elia's open eyes like he was witnessing a miracle unfold in real life. The doctor looked at the monitor again, then leaned down and whispered just loud enough for those nearby to hear. She made it. No applause, no celebratory cheer. Just that one quiet confirmation, tiny yet tremendous, rippled through the hospital corridors with the footsteps now racing toward the good news. Elia tried turning her head, her body still weighed down as if under rubble. Her voice barely there, but a fragile sound escaped. David. Angela nodded, whispering. He's here. And Ronan, too. As though he had heard his name, Ronan, still lying outside, suddenly lifted his head. His eyes turned to the ICU door. Without signal or command, he stood up. David, seated in the corridor, sensed it too. He looked at Ronan, then rose slowly, resting his hand on the dog's head in quiet companionship. A nurse opened the door. When David stepped inside, Elia was already looking toward him, her gaze no longer lost in fog. For a moment, no one spoke. They simply looked at one another, in a room now filled with light, as if they had both walked through darkness and now stood face to face on the other side. David moved closer. He didn't ask questions. He didn't repeat old thank yous. He simply bowed, low, deliberate, as if before an old commander. Elia tried to speak, but her throat was dry. She looked instead to the side of the bed. And then Ronan stepped forward. The old shepherd didn't bark, didn't leap. He walked slowly, steadily to her bedside, head lowered just like he had done countless times before when comforting wounded soldiers. His nose brushed gently against her wrist, the one still wrapped in bandage and stained with dried blood. A breath, warm and brief. Elia closed her eyes, not from exhaustion but from the overwhelming peace. Her lips moved barely a whisper. You stayed too. The doctor looked around the room. The young woman who had just returned from the edge, the quiet veteran, the German shepherd with wise eyes, and the tear-holding hospital staff holding each other's hands. And he knew this wasn't just another survival story. It was the first time in his 22-year career that he saw a patient return to life in the embrace of so many lives she herself had once protected. The news spread almost instantly. Outside the hospital when a nurse stepped out holding up a small sign hastily written in marker. She opened her eyes. The silent crowd that had stood like a stone wall broke. No cheers, but one by one people began removing their hats, placing hands over hearts. A silent, solemn tribute. Some elders bowed. Young ones gripped each other's hands tightly. Then, the motorcycles started up, rolling away quietly. They had come like the wind, and now they left like breath after a battle had ended. Inside the ICU, the light remained soft. Elia was breathing evenly now, the ventilator settings eased. Ronan lay curled beside her bed, his head resting gently beside the IV line, as if guarding each drop. Angela gently brushed a strand of hair behind Elia's ear and smiled softly. The doctor said, "You're still here with us." Elia's lips moved, this time more clearly. "Yeah, I'm still here." The noonday light spilled quietly through the sheer white curtains, casting a gentle glow across the hospital bed where Elia now rested. More lucid than the day before, alert enough to sit upright with the help of Angela and the attending nurse. Her hair clung in tangles against the pillow, damp with sweat. But her face held a strange calm, as if the pain that once tore through her chest had left behind something deeply real and enduring. Sam nudged the bed closer to the window, responding to a whispered request from Elia. She didn't explain. She only said, "I want to see outside." When the curtain was drawn to the side, Elia turned her head, and her heart skipped a beat. Down below, along the stone walkway leading to the hospital's front entrance, hundreds of people still stood. No banners, no cameras, no cheers. Just a long line of quiet figures in heavy jackets, weathered caps, and dark military boots. They didn't push forward, didn't shuffle restlessly. Each one stood still, backs straight, hands resting calmly at their sides, or clasped before them, as if on guard, as if waiting for an order that would never need to be spoken. Sunlight glanced off the faded silver emblems on their jackets, symbols once worn by those who had carried the SEAL badge, who had crossed battlefields in silence and somehow returned. Elia couldn't move. Her eyes stung, not from pain, but something else entirely. Sam stepped beside her, voice low and steady. "Do you know who they are?" Elia shook her head slightly, her gaze still locked beyond the glass. "They're men and women Ronan once saved, or those who fought beside David. But more than that," Sam paused. "There are people who believe that if someone has the courage to stand between danger and another life, then that person deserves to be protected until the very end." He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You saved one of them, someone they consider a legend, and now they're here for you. Not because of orders, not for the news. They came for something else." Elia leaned her head back against the pillow, still looking toward the window. She couldn't name each face, but she felt it. From the way they stood, from the angle of their eyes fixed toward her room, that every single person carried a quiet promise. We don't leave anyone behind. In that moment, she thought of her father, a soldier who had passed 3 years earlier. He had once said, "When you stand up for someone, there will always be someone behind you, if you dare to believe it." And now, through a pane of glass, she saw that truth made real people who didn't need to speak, because their presence alone was enough to warm a heart that had just returned from the edge of darkness. Angela stepped in, holding a small handwritten sign scrawled with a thick marker. "She's awake. Thank you for standing with her." She handed the sign to Sam, and together they stepped out onto the second-floor balcony, just across from the ICU wing, holding it high for the crowd to see. Dozens of eyes turned upward. One man placed his hand solemnly over his heart. Another removed his cap and bowed. A young veteran, barely out of service, raised his arm in a sharp military salute, wordless. That living wall built from silence and respect remained steady. But now it was more than a shield. It was a message: she's back. And we, those who owe her more than words, will remain until she can stand on her own. Elia spotted Ronan from afar, sitting beside David beneath a tree. The shepherd's posture was as steady as always, but this time his head was held higher, ears perked, eyes watching the window above as if attuned to the tiniest change in her movement. When her eyes met those amber ones, Ronan tilted his head, just slightly. A nod, as if to say, "I saw you. And now, I can rest easy." David didn't look up. He remained beside Ronan, hand resting gently on the dog's neck. But somehow Elia knew. He could feel her gaze. Something unfurled inside her. Not loud, not overwhelming. Just a warm hush weaving through her veins. She had never thought herself important enough to warrant this. She had expected no thanks from the hundreds of souls who had walked battlefields. But this moment, with the pale blue sky, with the quiet reflections in the glass, with figures standing still in the middle of a noisy world, was the greatest reward she had ever known. Not for recognition, but because hearts, hers and theirs, had found each other without needing to speak a single word. Sam smiled quietly. "You're not just a nurse anymore." Elia's voice was hoarse but clear. "I only did what needed to be done." Sam looked at her with a kind warmth. And that is what they've spent a lifetime searching for, in someone who never wore the uniform. The wall clock struck 6 a.m. A new day began in the hospital. But for Elia, each day since awakening felt twice as long. Not because of time, but because of the silent pain that returned without warning. The sharp breaths in the middle of the night, the moments when her body felt too far behind her will to keep up. She lay still, eyes fixed on the ceiling's white plaster, where faint stains lingered like shadows from years past. Both arms rested by her sides, fingers trembling softly from exhaustion and medication. Angela came in first that morning, carrying a basin of warm water, a folded towel, and the smile that never left her face. "Good morning, warrior," she said softly out of habit. Elia forced a grin. It wasn't easy to smile when her chest still ached like it held the memory of every blade. She had once thought surviving pain meant passing through it once. But now she knew. It arrived hourly, with every attempt to sit, to lift her hand, to roll onto her side. "I still can't sit up by myself," Elia whispered, breath tight. "Not yet," Angela replied, wringing out the towel. "But soon. A little more each day." That afternoon, a man in a thick military-style coat stepped quietly into Elia's room. His hair was salt and pepper, his shoulders broad despite the years. In his hands was a small dented tin box. He paused when he saw how tired Elia looked, then smiled gently. "I might be early," he said, But Ronan told me this is usually the time you wake up. Elia looked at the man, his face unfamiliar, yet his eyes held an uncanny resemblance to David's. I'm one of David's old teammates. Name's Carl. I came to tell a story, or at least to bother you a little in the best way. He sat down in the chair and opened the lid of a small tin box. Inside were old photographs, so aged their colors had faded, the edges curled and worn. This was the Silent Flame team. Ronan was our honorary member, back when he didn't have that scar on his hind leg. Elia looked at the photos and let out a faint laugh. In one picture, a group of young soldiers stood beside a confident German shepherd. Its coat thick and proud, its eyes lifted as if the world belonged to it. Ronan. Look, that mighty Carl nodded. And he still is, because he's here, with you. That afternoon, a young man, perhaps 28, walked in. He wore a faded hoodie with a worn seal emblem printed across the chest. His face was sun-kissed, but there was a gentle light tucked into the corners of his eyes. I'm Brian. When I was injured in Fallujah, Ronan found me after 3 days. When I heard you took a knife for David and Ronan, didn't know what to say, except come. He hesitated, then pulled from his pocket a small badge with the number 43, his old unit. He placed it on the bedside table. Not many people we call family, but you already are. Elia looked at the badge, then into Brian's eyes, not the eyes of a stranger. These were the eyes of someone who had seen loss, had touched the edge between life and death, and now looked at her with quiet gratitude for still being here. That evening, Elia wrestled with pain as she tried to sit up on her own. She hadn't called for a nurse. She wanted to try. Just this once. Sweat pooled on her forehead. Her hands trembled against the mattress. Her stomach tightened as if something inside was being wrung. But she pushed inch by inch. Angela walked in, startled. Elia, God! Elia gritted her teeth, her eyes blurred with tears. I just wanted to sit. Once. Just to believe I can start over. Angela rushed to support her, steady and gentle. Their eyes met. No further words were needed. They both understood that from this moment, when Elia lifted herself even just a few inches, the battle had shifted. No longer was it about survival. It was about reclaiming herself. Ronan stood outside the doorway, watching. His amber eyes reflected the white hospital lights, yet within them was a look Elia had seen before, on the battlefield. The quiet patience of a teammate waiting for another to rise. Elia turned toward him and gave a slight nod. Tomorrow, we'll take one more step. Together, right? Ronan didn't nod back, but his tail gently tapped the floor, soft but certain. That morning, Elia sat up against the bed, her hair tied back, arms still bandaged, but her gaze was different. No longer dulled by pain, but clearer, steadier, as if every day of recovery wasn't just healing her body, but forging something stronger within. Angela came in as usual, carrying a stack of letters from the reception desk. Most were get-well cards sent from all over. Some had names. Some were simply signed from someone who's grateful. Your fan club's growing, Angela chuckled, placing the stack on the bedside table. Elia smiled, reaching for one when Angela paused, pulling out a thick white envelope. No hospital logo, no stamp, no return address. Just a single handwritten line in bold ink for the one who stepped in front of the blade. For a dog. Angela looked up, eyes wide. This one feels different. Elia took the envelope, a tightness rising in her chest. She ran her fingers over the words. The ink pressed deep into the paper, as if it carried weight. She opened it carefully. Inside was a bank check. Amount $100,000. V. Verified transfer code. Signature blank. Elia froze. A hush fell over the room. No beeping monitors, no squeaking wheels, only the slow breath she drew and the sunlight casting soft clarity on the printed numbers. Angela leaned closer as if to confirm her eyes weren't lying. $100,000? Real? Elia nodded, lips tight, eyes beginning to blur. Not from the money, but from the words on the envelope. A single line, no name, no title, no lavish praise. Just a direct, unmistakable truth so piercing it was beautiful for the one who stepped in front of the blade. For a dog. That line peeled back the exact moment she'd hurled herself in front of David and Ronan. There hadn't been time to weigh the decision. No medical training taught that response. It was instinct, born from something deeper than thought. She began to cry. Tears spilled over her hands, soaking into the check. And the room filled with a silent emotion, not for the gift itself, but for the knowledge that someone somewhere had understood her deeply enough to entrust her with their quiet reverence. Angela sat beside her, hand resting on Elia's shoulder. Maybe it was someone Ronan saved, or someone who lost something, and realized nothing's more valuable than a right act done at the right time. Elia clutched the paper, then placed it on the table, smoothing the crease with trembling hands. I can't keep this for myself. Angela stayed silent, offering no argument, no suggestion, just looking at her as if already knowing she'd say that. I'll start a fund, Elia said, voice still shaking. A fund to care for and train retired dogs, especially canines who served in the military. Then she turned toward the door, where Ronan still lay, paws crossed, gaze soft as ever. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it for beings like Ronan, those who've silently guarded our lives and were forgotten once they left the battlefield. That night, Elia wrote a letter. She didn't send it. She simply placed it in an envelope, tucked it alongside a photocopy of the check, and slid it between the pages of her notebook. The letter wasn't long. She wrote, I don't know who you are. Maybe you've never met me. Or maybe you once stood in the middle of a war I will never understand. But you saw me, not through a camera, not through headlines, but through a decision I once believed was the most instinctive I'd ever made. I stood between a blade and a dog, but what I truly did was protect something purer than logic. Connection. Thank you for trusting me that deeply. I will use this gift for something I believe you were also thinking of. With gratitude, Elia. The next day, she filed a request to establish a foundation named Paw Sentinel, the four-legged watchman. And when the hospital director asked her why that name, Elia simply smiled. Because there are lives that once stood guard for us without ever being honored. And now, it's our turn to guard their rest. That morning, sunlight poured diagonally through the third-floor window, falling onto the hospital carpet in gentle streaks that felt like a caress. Elia had just finished her light rehabilitation exercises. Her left leg still ached, but she insisted on sitting on the bench in the hallway, where she could see the trembling branches in the breeze and hear distant traffic like the sound of a world still spinning. Angela laid a light blanket across her knees and carefully adjusted the cushion behind her back. It's a calm day, and the first time you've agreed to leave your room. Elia nodded slightly, her nostrils flaring with the tangle of emotions. Something about it felt both familiar and strange. How long had it been since she last smelled sunshine on skin, or listened to the world breathe without hearing it through layers of ICU glass? At the far end of the hallway, the elevator doors opened with a soft, low chime. Elia turned her head. David stepped out, his figure still as weathered and calm as the first time she saw him at that tiny diner. except now he wore a thick wool coat, the collar worn but pressed. Beside him, Ronan walked in steady strides, 4 solid paws touching the floor without a sound. There had been no call, no text to warn her. But Elia knew, from the way Ronan lifted his head, ears pointed high, that none was needed. Some reunions aren't scheduled. They happen by instinct, when hearts that have survived battle recognize the right moment. David stopped in front of her, pulled off his knit cap, and gave a nod that carried everything he meant to say. No speeches, no repeat of thanks. Elia smiled and nodded in return. But it was Ronan, true to himself, who spoke first in his own silent way. He approached slowly but surely, amber eyes lit by sunlight like twin embers. When he was less than a meter away, he tilted his head then, stepped closer gently, as if afraid of causing her pain. Elia said nothing. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers unfolding slightly like an open invitation. And then, in a moment no one could prepare for, Ronan placed his head in her lap. It wasn't a collapse, and it wasn't the tail-wagging joy of an excited dog. Ronan leaned in, slowly touched his cheek to her knee, and exhaled. A deep breath that sounded like it had come from a memory far away. Elia gasped softly at the warmth seeping through her hospital gown from the dog's head. Her hand moved instinctively to the space between Ronan's ears, where she knew from his K9 medical file a small scar once lived. Sunlight touched his back, turning his dark brown fur into something velvety and glowing. She could feel his calm breathing and his heartbeat. The heartbeat of a life that had once walked through war, had once scented gunfire, blood, and smoke, and was now lying still beneath the hand of someone it had chosen to trust. Angela stood nearby, a stack of folders in her arms. She quietly pulled out her phone, not to take a photo, but just to type a quick message. Ronan just laid his head in Elia's lap. The whole hallway stopped breathing. David sat beside them, his gaze not on Ronan nor on Elia. He looked through the window where light danced on leaves and said in a voice rough and low. The last time he did that was in 2015, at a border outpost. A young soldier was badly wounded, screaming in pain. Ronan came over, didn't do anything flashy, just laid his head on the kid's stomach like that. And from that moment, the boy gritted his teeth through surgery, without anesthesia. Elia blinked. David turned toward her, his eyes now focused and steady. "You're the second person." Elia lowered her head, eyes now blurred with tears, but she didn't wipe them away. She placed both hands around Ronan's neck, hugging him, as if holding on to a friend who had been lost too long, but finally found his way back. "I don't know what I did to deserve this," she whispered. David didn't answer. He rose and gently tapped her shoulder. "You lived, and that's enough." When Ronan finally lifted his head, he stretched his legs slightly, then lay down right beside Elia, head high, eyes fixed on the hallway as if standing guard. Not as an assignment, but as a choice. The hallway was still. Other patients walking past slowed down, drawn to the scene without words. An older janitor stood quietly in the corner and whispered, "That's no longer just a dog. That's a symbol." And Elia, still seated, said nothing, didn't move. Her hand remained resting on his fur like a silent thank you. Because sometimes the deepest bond between human and animal is when both choose to stay, even when no one asks them to. That afternoon, in the quiet warmth of physical therapy, Elia sat with her hands around her knee, supported by a machine gently stretching her leg. The pain was still there, but it no longer roared like it did last week. What furrowed her brow now wasn't the movement in her muscles, but the envelope sitting quietly on the table beside her. The letter was printed on coarse paper, embossed with the seal of Veteran's Circle. The opening line had no flair, no formality. Just one sentence: "We want to meet you. And if it feels right, we'd like to invite you to join." At the bottom corner, a handwritten signature: Carl, the man who once brought her that old box of photographs and the stories of silent fire. Angela stepped in and saw Elia staring intently at the letter. She tilted her head and asked gently, "What has you so quiet all of a sudden?" Elia held up the letter, turning it slowly in her hands. "They want me to attend the veterans meeting this Saturday," she said. "Not to share a story, not as an honored guest." She paused, her gaze taking on a distant glimmer, "but to join as a volunteer medical staff for the group." Angela raised an eyebrow. "You'd be the nurse for an entire veterans unit, not just the unit," Elia replied slowly. "For missions supporting discharged soldiers, the ones who live in isolation or those still haunted by PTSD, the ones who can't make it to hospitals, but still need someone to listen and someone to help them heal." The meeting took place in a small riverside hall, once an old maintenance post, now rebuilt with oak wood and faded red brick. No signboards, no buzz, just a quiet symbol of an iron helmet hung above the door. David brought Elia there, but didn't come inside. He only said, "They're waiting for you," then stepped back, one hand resting on Ronan's back. A silent signal of safety. Elia stepped in. Inside the modest wooden room, over 20 people were seated around a long table. Their faces were varied, some with white hair, others in dark glasses, one young man with a prosthetic arm. But they all shared the same look, worn, yet calm. Carl was the first to rise. "Welcome, Elia. You owe us nothing. But if you're willing, we'd like to invite you to join the post-service care network. No uniforms, no weapons, just a pair of ears to listen, and a hand to place gently on a shoulder when needed." He held out a name tag: Medic, Veterans Circle. Elia took it, feeling her palm warm up as if a small flame had bloomed inside it. But she said nothing yet. A woman stood, skin tanned by sun voice, carrying the softness of the South. "I lost my brother after he came home. Not to bombs, but to silence. He had no one to tell about the fear still lodged in his chest. If someone like you had been there, maybe it would have ended differently." The man beside her added, "You're not a psychologist, but you're someone who stepped forward when others turned away. That's enough." Elia's fingers tightened around the tag. Part of her wanted to say, "I'm not ready," but then a single question echoed in her mind. When will I be ready, if not now? She thought of that rainy night, the knife Ronan's head resting in her lap. Of the hundreds who stood beneath the ICU windows, not seeking glory, but offering belief. Of David, always waiting outside quiet like an old tree. And above all, she thought of herself. Once a nurse lost in charts, sterile procedures, and clinical pressure. And now someone beginning to understand there is a place beyond protocols where what matters most is not credentials, but presence. She lifted her gaze and met the eyes around the room. "I don't wear a rank. I've never held a weapon. But if an ordinary nurse like me can help someone live one more today, then I'll stay. For however long I choose. But today, I am ready." No applause followed. But glances softened, tense shoulders eased, like a wound unwrapped for the first time. When she stepped out of the hall, Elia walked slower than usual. David was waiting by the car, his eyes asking a question he never voiced. Elia didn't answer aloud. She just held up the new badge, Medic, and smiled. David nodded. Ronan stepped forward, tail swaying gently. No bark, no leap, just walking beside her like a companion who had always been meant to wait. Elia looked up. For the first time in many months, the afternoon sky glowed gold, the same color as her father's old shirt. And for the first time she understood. To be needed is not a duty. It is a gift. The auditorium was small, yet every seat was filled. On a stage, the backdrop displayed the emblem of Paw Sentinel, the four-legged gatekeeper. Beneath it, a handwritten slogan. A glance, a nod, sometimes that's enough to keep someone going. No flashy lights, no TV cameras. Yet all eyes followed the woman stepping onto the podium. Her hair tied low, faint marks, still visible on her hands from IV lines, but her steps steady. Elia stood tall. In the warm glow of yellow stage lights, her face was serene. Not the confidence of a stage veteran, but the calm of someone who had touched pain at its deepest and knew what must be kept. "Thank you all for coming," she began. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I'm not here to tell a story of heroism. To be honest, I never saw myself as the main character in any story at all." A soft laugh rippled through the front rows. Then silence returned. "I'm a nurse, just a regular person getting off shift on a rainy night." I walked into a small diner, tired, hungry, and hoping for nothing more than a warm bowl of soup. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the front row, where David sat, his hand resting on Ronan's back. The German shepherd lay curled by his feet, so still he could have been asleep. But Elia knew. Ronan was listening and feeling. And then I saw an old man sitting quietly with his dog. Nothing remarkable. Just a small stillness in a city that never stops. Her voice slowed, pulling memories up from deep inside. Then two strangers entered. They started with words. But as you all know, there are words sharper than knives. The room went still. Most here had read the headlines, heard the news, or had been there when it all unfolded. But no one interrupted. No one filled the silence. Because they hadn't come for a retelling. They came to hear what had never been spoken. I don't remember the exact moment the knife touched me. Elia said, her eyes glassy with the weight of everything rising inside. But I remember Ronan's eyes, when he growled and leapt. I remember David's trembling hand on my shoulder. And I remember the sound of paws. She paused. The sound of footsteps, Elia said softly. Hundreds of them. No orders, no brass bands. Yet they came. They stood there beneath the skin-cutting cold outside the ICU, not out of duty. Just because one wounded person had chosen to protect a soul others deemed disposable. Elia took a deep breath. Her shoulders weren't tense. They rested in a stillness that came from steadiness. I didn't save anyone. She said, her voice firmer than ever. I simply chose to stay when I saw a soul being violated. In the crowd, someone lowered their head and quietly wiped their eyes. No applause, no interruptions. In the front row, David sat upright, his head giving a subtle nod. Not too noticeable, not dramatic. But within that nod was the weight of decades, of understanding shaped by battlefield loneliness, and of gratitude too deep for words. Ronan hadn't moved, but his ears had lifted slightly, and his tail tapped gently against the leg of the chair, like a soft wave of silent approval. Elia saw it, and something in her chest grew warm. Not because of the full house, not because the fundraising total kept rising, but because in this moment, beneath the mellow lights and whispering ceiling fans, Ronan was still there. Like a quiet flame in an old hearth, never blazing, but never extinguished. The event closed with a gentle piano piece played by a young veteran. People filtered out, but Elia remained at the edge of the stage a little longer, gazing at the emptying rows. David came up beside her. He said nothing. He just stood there, just like he did that night outside the diner, letting her follow, never pushing, never leading. Elia turned to him and smiled. That night? Why didn't you stop me? David looked at her, his gaze deepened. Because I saw something I'd only ever seen in those who kept their unit breathing. That look, it never lies. She lowered her head, then reached down and placed a hand gently on Ronan's head, whispering, "Thank you for not leaving me behind, even when I didn't know what I was doing." Ronan didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply closed his eyes and leaned into her palm, as if among the thousands of human words there are emotions that don't need to be named. The story of Elia David and the German shepherd Ronan isn't just a poignant moment carved out of chaos. It's proof of the power of compassion, the bond between humans and animals, and the immeasurable value of a single courageous act. Ronan, the German shepherd, didn't need praise nor medals. His presence alone, his listening gaze, his willingness to step into danger, was enough to alter one person's fate and awaken an entire community. This breed isn't just intelligent or powerful. It stands as a symbol of unwavering loyalty, of quiet strength that knows exactly how to reach the heart. Elia, once just a nurse living by shifts and medical records, had become part of something larger. A family without blood where humans and dogs walk side by side, healing wounds that modern life often forgets. And as this story closes, maybe you, who are listening, will look at the dogs around you a little differently. Love animals the way you wish to be loved. Because sometimes it's the quietest creatures who guard our memories, our warmth, and our most fragile trust in this life. And if someday you meet a German shepherd on the street, don't just see a dog. Remember that might be a hero, silently watching over the world for you.